Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer, as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Always glad to be here.
You are welcome. Welcome. Now, today, several big topics again today, and let's start with Biden and Trump debate. Biden's disastrous debate performance, and that has, given many are calling out for him to step down from that and give chance to someone else as the Democratic presidential candidate. Kamala Harris's name is coming on strong. Others have also been coming in. What do you make of? What should we understand? Is will this happen? Will this not happen? And how do you see this impacting elections going forward?
So the main issue, of course, is Biden's health and mental capacity to govern, continue to govern as president. Now, it's worth noting that many of the issues that surfaced during debate were present before the debate just as well, but until that point, the media was pretending that none of it was very important. All of a sudden, they switched gears and piled on and started pressuring Biden to withdraw. And it is only if he withdraws that the Democratic Party can nominate another candidate. Now, Kamala Harris appears to be the natural successor because she is the current vice president, and also because there is very little time to prepare another candidate, and there is also the issue with the ballots. The names of the candidates are already on the ballots, so if Biden were to withdraw, Kamala Harris would still remain on the ballot and she could bring in somebody else as her VP. But the Biden is refusing to withdraw so far, despite pressure from Obama, from donors, from the media, and from his own advisors. He's said to be increasingly isolated and controlled by a small group of trusted advisors, and they're the ones who are said to have been covering up his health issues. And so there's a lot of internal acrimony as a result. But there's problems for the Democrats either way. If Biden stays, there'll be concerns that he will not be able to perform independently as a president, that his wife is already controlling a lot of his actions, and that all of this appears unseemly, and the adversaries of the United States are taking advantage of that. Under normal circumstances, even if the president is incapacitated, the administration takes charge of the affairs. But on foreign policy, you really need a decision maker. And if you have decisions made by a committee of several advisors and there's no final vote, then it becomes unclear who actually is governing the country. And we're already seeing Russia and China commenting on this issue, which is the worst possible outcome. If Biden does withdraw, Kamala Harris comes in. She's not well liked within the party, either by voters or by Biden himself or anyone else. She's not extremely unpopular, which will make it very difficult to generate excitement for the elections, and it will make it very difficult for her to govern, quite frankly. Finally, if there's another candidate that is more popular, more capable, that person is left with very little time to prepare. That person is unlikely to have a long foreign policy record. That person will have no record whatsoever versus Trump's record, which he's currently touting. And that person will also be facing opposition from within the Democratic Party, from Kamala Harris's team, and from others, as well as the issue again with the ballots, and the fact that replacing the ballots is going to be a hassle, and all of that also gives, regardless, it all gives Trump advantage. But the biggest issue is not the issue of candidates. The biggest issue is the record and the policy of the Biden administration, which is quite dismal and is not getting any better in light of recent developments. International economy continues to suffer as a result of the shipping disruptions in the Red Sea. So far, no serious action has been undertaken to put an end to the Houthi aggression in the Red Sea. There are two major conflicts that are ongoing and are far from settled and unlikely to be settled in time for the elections, despite some promising signs. Um, it remains to be seen what happens, but right now the Democrats are at a strong disadvantage, regardless of what they choose.
Right, Irina. But one thing is that regarding this debate, isn't it something that people knew all around? This was very much in the open. It is just that uh, they needed a debate like this to show actually where the problem was,
It
and that
was
is
very
where when it came up, people are now talking about it openly, even their Democrats themselves.
it was very much in the open in with the public, but no one wanted to admit it. And the media was desperately trying to cover up. Now Biden took on a major interview, and the journalists covering the interview themselves also said that the interview did not put all of these concerns to rest. And Biden was never a strong debater to begin with, but this is not an issue of being a skillful debater. This is an issue of simply not having the mental capacity to handle ongoing live discussions without assistance. So that's the real problem here.
Right. So how is it one? What should one understand? Is it now getting one-sided? And Donald Trump, has got a lot of advantage after this debate. Does the
I,
Democrat
I
have that?
think the biggest problem is that the way the Democrats handled the situation. First by trying to cover up, then by trying to air all of this in public, which looks bad no matter what you want to hear, instead of handling it quietly and making the decision. So there's clear panic, disarray, chaos. That's never a good thing. And the second issue is that they're not really promising to fix any of the problems they're not admitting to failures. You know, if Biden or somebody on his team just said, "Look, here's where we did well or sufficiently successful with at least part of the public to continue, and this is where we are going to change our tactics going forward," but they're refusing to admit that there's anything wrong with anything they've done, and that's causing a lot of. I think this is the real issue. I think people would be far less likely to care whether it's Biden or Kamala Harris or Jill Biden who's actually leading the charge, as long as the policies were in place that were actually working and efficient, and there was a sign that the administration is learning from the mistakes and is turning the wheels in a way that's making US stronger, not weaker. But this is not happening, and I think that's why people are now so focused on Biden's age, even though his age was always there and those problems were always there. This is almost an excuse for the Democrats not to admit to the problems that they had time to fix, even in time for the elections, which I've previously noted, but they have not taken any serious action, even despite recommendations and despite every opportunity that they had.
Right, Irina. So what happens to now? There are few months left. Elections are still a bit away from now, and those months, can be very crucial, especially with the Middle East crisis, with the Ukraine crisis, Ukraine-Russia crisis, Russia extending its or expanding its feet everywhere. So how do you see people will take Joe Biden's presidential remaining months? I don't know about the after that, but how will they look at the US now in the present, in the backdrop of what the result of the debate was?
Well, I think I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to find a quick fix solution instead of actually really focusing on the issues going forward. And this is exactly what we're seeing, unfortunately. And that's unfortunate for the public. And I think the public is going to remember that when push came to shove, the Democrats did not focus on what will serve the public the best. They focused on political issues that will serve their own interest the most. And by the way, all of that combined with the fact that now Trump has received partial immunity from some of his actions that were under investigation or in trial. There are legal issues plaguing some of the other state level investigations, like the Georgia election interference case, where there's a problem with the prosecutor. It doesn't look like any of that is going to get resolved before the elections. So all the Hail Marys that the Democrats were counting on in case things went awry with Biden's age down the road to save them, they're not going to work out. For them, this is a bad combination. And right now, they're desperately scrambling for some diplomatic wins. They're pushing the ceasefire proposal that would allow the Israeli military to stay in and Hamas to release some of the remaining hostages, including soldiers. But I think it would be very foolish to put any faith into Hamas to actually commit to anything that does not serve their long term survival. And on the other hand, with Ukraine, Zelensky appears to have been pressured into inviting Russia to the peace negotiations, albeit not putting a land for peace, so the so-called solution, on the table. I don't think this was his own idea, because he previously rejected it. I think the administration is trying to get him to is responding to the criticism of the past initiatives, which did not include Russia, and just to maybe show that they're open to this idea, or that they're trying real diplomacy, maybe to try to get non-Western countries to buy in if Russia is present more. We are seeing that as a sign that there is really a lot of strain on the on the diplomatic side, on the State Department, and we are also seeing that they're trying to turn this NATO summit that's coming up in Washington into a big win. Because in addition to the usual Western countries, they're also inviting Arab states, and they'll be talking not only about Ukraine but also about Gaza, with the hope of probably building some bridges with the Arab countries, getting them to invest more into post-war governance and to overcome some of the issues with Israel and so forth. So they're trying these major, very public initiatives to make it look like they're doing something successful on that front.
Right, right. Well explained there, Irina. Now let's move on to the UK. Wipe out of the Tory party means what happened? Suddenly, it's all the labor of love for the Labour Party. Help us understand then how it's
Well,
all going to change.
Well, I think the election was more of a rejection of the Tories than the embrace of the Labour, because Labour actually won with less than 34% of the votes, which is only possible because of the parliamentary system here. The Tories have been in power for 14 years, so that was certainly a factor, and people are just tired. They actually did not. They made a very messy record between mishandling Brexit in a way that was overpromised and in many ways underdelivered and inconsistent with the promises. There was a lot of backtracking on economic liberalization, too much emphasis on green energy, and compromising with the left. So they betrayed their base on many levels. And they were very hesitant on many issues, including foreign policy issues. Um, they were also plagued by a number of leadership changes, which were simply not a very good look, and made it seem like there's a serious political problem inside the party. And uh, leading up to the elections, there was a number of corruption scandals that were also their part of their undoing, and which made even staunch supporters refuse to vote for them, or in some cases even switch to Labour for the first time in some of the districts. That said, Labor, although they have tried to get rid of the more extreme members of their party, and it served them well. I think they're not all that popular because some of their positions have also been repeatedly rejected by the voters and they continue to be rejected by the voters, as we see by their numbers. Some of the extreme members trying to become independent candidates, and they won in sufficient numbers to be of concern, not sufficient enough to necessarily derail the entire governance, but they are going to be vocal and they are going to be active in trying to change, to continue with their positions and kind of radicalize the base. The positive news is that the number of liberals, which in the UK, unlike the United States, doesn't mean just leftist progressives. It means essentially centrist candidates who are pushing for dialogue, economic liberalism, individual rights, and basically a focus based on the original kind of British Burkesque philosophy. Um, they've gained astounding numbers considering how far they've fallen over the past decades from their peak. Back in the day, now have 71 MPs, and they're going to be there to basically put pressure on Labour to not go too far off into the extreme and to not basically betray their more centrist commitments that they have announced. So the Tories will are now seeking a new leadership, and there are several candidates. Sunak has resigned, or basically he will step down the moment a new person is found. Suella Braverman from his government is one of the potential candidates, but we will see what happens. Tories will have a lot of re-evaluation to do going forward because of this complete disaster.
Complete disaster. So, what is there for the world now? Means how will should the world look at it? What changes for the world now?
Well, Starmer is trying to create a Tony Blair-like centrist government, but some of the foreign policy positions appear to be very similar to what the previous government has had. On Gaza, for instance, they're committed to pushing for a ceasefire, but without necessarily immediate recognition of the Palestinian state, which they initially promised, and then right before the elections backtracked on. Likely the position on Ukraine will continue to be fairly stable as well. Most of the changes are probably going to be domestic. But one of the biggest foreign policy changes is the efforts to renegotiate the post-Brexit deal with the EU to grow closer with Berlin, which is already happening from day one, and to put an end, to the extent possible, to the Rwanda deportation decision made in the last days of the Tory government. Not all of that is possible to backtrack because there are civil servant level commitments to implementation that can't be easily reversed. But to the extent possible, they're trying to erase that. There's, of course, going to be reevaluation of the economic commitments, healthcare system, assistance for the poor and the indigent. All of these very traditional left-leaning positions are likely to be implemented fairly quickly.
Right, right, Irina. Now let's move on from UK to the Middle East, and there, how does it look like this new talk of this new ceasefire deal, Hamas and Israel? How does it look like? Is it going to happen? Has Hamas come down to giving up its strong position and looking for a deal? Why is it doing so? How do we look? How should we look at it? Should we look at it with hope, or will it be continue to be a difficult position down there at Middle East?
Let's remind ourselves that it is the 10th ceasefire proposal in the 9th month of the war. This one was initiated by the United States. It would allow the Israeli forces to not withdraw from Gaza, and in the phase 2 of the deal, Hamas would release some of the remaining hostages, including some of the soldiers, which they previously refused to do, and some dead bodies would be returned for burial as well. Hamas according to a leaked rumor of an anonymous source, claimed that they are accepting this deal for the first time. They're not going to be insisting on a permanent withdrawal of the Israeli forces before implementation, but that does not. And there was a great deal of optimism from the U.S. and some of the Israeli sources about this being turned into a potential long-term ceasefire solution. I am far less optimistic. First of all, Hamas has previously, having a quote-unquote accepted proposal number 9, ultimately balked on the details, and right now we don't even have an official acceptance. This is an anonymous source who could be anybody, not even from Hamas necessarily, sharing these early discussions. And the question is, why are they leaking this information so early in the process when previously nothing was leaked until Hamas officially announced something, and this is not an official announcement. The second issue is that Hamas's goal, as I mentioned, is its long-term survival. So if they are going to release a small percentage of the hostages in exchange for a break to regroup, they're willing to do that, and they're fully aware that Israel is not going to withdraw regardless of what they say. So for them, accepting this in principle is not really a big deal. Uh, but the third possibility here is that it could be worse. It could be a trap. It could be a time-wasting opportunity of some sort. We just don't know what they're going to demand in exchange, and they're going to demand something. They're not just going to let Israeli troops remain there for free, and they're not going to give away part of their only remaining leverage for free. If Israel remains in Rafah, especially, it will continue controlling the tunnels and blocking Hamas ability to continue smuggling weapons. By the way, there's no clear explanation for why those tunnels have not yet been completely cemented over or destroyed or flooded with water, exploded, whatever needs to be done to make sure that they're no longer usable. Why are Israelis guarding them instead of putting an end to them altogether? That is, another, question. My concern is that the Israeli government is going to be pressured by the U.S. to retain those tunnels for future, and with the hope of who knows what. Maybe Hamas is making that as a condition of return of the hostages, and the U.S. is probably thinking that this is the best deal that they could get out of it. So in the long term, Hamas is looking for long term survival. So if the tunnels are not destroyed but merely guarded, at some point Israel is going to have to leave, and they can return to the usual. Maybe that's the thinking here.
Right, Irina. So both Israel and the Middle East crisis as well as the Ukraine. Now Ukraine one coming up in the NATO summit in Washington, and it will bring Arab states and address both these issues. And amidst all these things, Orban visits Moscow. Zelensky has rejected ceasefire proposal, and Hungary has assumed this EU presidency. How should we look at this NATO summit? Will it give any concrete thing amidst all these things? Turkey has sought a membership of uh, SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and amidst all this, so is how much is it going to impact NATO? More NATO exerts, more it looks like it is losing its position and power. Help us in that direction in terms of the crisis as well as in terms of Turkey's dual loyalties splitting. Will it split NATO?
Well, one of the big issues for Ukraine at the summit is the potential negotiations over joining NATO. Now, repeatedly, this proposal has been rejected because Ukraine remains partially occupied. Now, a few days ago, an article came out in the British Telegraph, basically stating that Ukraine is allegedly too corrupt to join NATO, but that was never one of the official reasons. And quite frankly, there's a number of countries that are equally, if not more corrupt, that are currently long-standing members of NATO, and others that are corrupt but are not publicly known for corruption, even though they're also extremely corrupt. They're simply not loud about it. for whatever reason. So I don't think corruption is the real reason for any for the indisposition of NATO to admit Ukraine as any members. I think there are two issues. First of all, of course, the cost of integrating a new member, and second of all, the fact that nobody wants to risk the invocation of Article 5 over Ukraine's war. Or what they perceive as Ukraine's war, they're willing to support it from a distance. There's still a great deal of reluctance to any serious security commitment, and I think this is something that Russia has been exploiting very, very successfully. I think the ultimate issue is not Ukraine. I think the ultimate issue is not even China, which is growing influence. The SCO conference is about to admit Belarus as its member. Not too surprising, all things considered. Belarus has been a strategic asset for Russia and certainly has been extremely pro-China as well. So it makes sense for that country to be in that particular configuration. I'm only surprised it has not done so earlier. But the bigger issue is the internal problems plaguing NATO. Rather than, they're not really growing their memberships, and two of the members are quite problematic. Hungary is attempting to play both sides, and it's only with exceeding level of pressure and negotiations that Orban has been, on some instances, cooperating with Ukraine aid packages and not really with anti-Russia sanctions. That's one problem. The second problem is Turkey, which is now openly also playing both sides and seeking to join the SCO as well, especially after the crackdown on the Russian banking connections, which have been fueling Turkey's flailing economy. So I think Turkey is basically trying to position itself as an independent actor which is doing whatever it needs in the interest of its geopolitical agenda. I think this is a radical departure from the traditional Turkey position on the subject. And I think presents a very dramatic and open break, not a surprising one given the trajectory for the last decade or so, but nevertheless dramatic departure from its policies and politics, and it shows that Turkey has really become a very different country in recent years. There is no clear pathway for it to leave NATO over its joining an alternative and competing defense defense bloc, but it is going to show that there are serious schisms inside NATO, and on the other hand, there aren't such schisms within the SEO bloc. There are differences between members, there are competing interests, but Russia and China have been positioning this bloc very carefully not to focus on the differences between the members and to keep it narrow to basically being an anti-Western bloc, right, while handling their own separate internal differences outside that particular structure. And I think that has served them well. And I think this is NATO needs to reevaluate going forward. I think there's been a bit of a mission creep within NATO from being a defense bloc focused on defense issues to trying to be everything for everybody, talking about environment and all these social issues that have nothing to do with its original mission. And that's only dividing the members.
Right, right. And amidst all these things, Belarus has joined the SCO as the new member, and that is where. And this whole new bloc is coming up very strongly. Looks like Russia is getting more friends in this sort of a bloc. And amidst all these things, India has said that it will not, go against de-dollarization. India prefers the dollar over the yuan as of now. How do you see this move from India? How do you read it from that part of that world?
Well, it's worth noting that Russia's influence is expanding, but it's expanding in the developing world, not so much um, in very pro-Western countries. But it has been trying, and some of the things it's been trying is basically lobbying for small, weaker, more corrupt, and more poor Central European and Eastern European countries. And we saw that the Slovakian PM, who was wounded in a bizarre shooting recently, in his first appearance, said that he wished he could have joined Orban in Moscow, which is, interesting, because on the one hand he is known to be pro-Russian, but on the other hand he had been shifting away from Russia on some issues, including Ukraine's defense. So he is once again trying to play both sides and to position himself as this negotiator, mediator, a guy who can be everything to everybody. I don't think it's going to work, but I think as a geopolitical matter, it is concerning, because Russia is making these seemingly incremental gains that ultimately turn into votes in the EU Parliament. They turn into pressure on the EU Commission. They turn into influence within individual countries, as we're seeing now in France. So it doesn't matter. India, it's not surprising that the position it took. China is not its economic friend, even though there are still deals that are being done with companies, but on state level, in terms of state policy, I think there is a great deal of difference. Moreover, from a pragmatic standpoint, yuan is simply not as stable as the dollar, and no amount of China's maneuvering to play on anti-Western sentiments around the world is going to change its own economic problems that are causing yuan to be unstable. And I think this is what ultimately India is looking at. It's uh, regardless of where one wants to be, it just does not make sense to change a more respected currency for another that is being overvalued and backed by unclear um, manipulations inside the Chinese banking system. So I think so it doesn't really speak to the long-term trajectory, but it does speak to India's own interest in the matter. And so long as the dollar continues to remain stable and U.S. continues to stick by its economic commitments, and to I think it's going to stay that way.
Right, right. And talking of Russia, a Russian terrorism suspect has been apprehended in Paris before the Olympic Games in August. How should we read it? Should we look at what is happening in Paris as more politics, or should we look at it from the games perspective? How does it look to be panning out?
Well, there's been a lot of warnings recently over ISIS-K expanding into Europe, potentially targeting the games, are very legitimate concerns. Terrorists tend to target big, crowded events. We've seen there was a terrorist incident with the Boston Marathon in the US. These types of events provide a perfect opportunity for international organizations looking to expand outwards and looking to grab attention for successful major attacks. What's more interesting, however, is not the Islamist jihadist groups known for doing that sort of thing, but that Russia is now not only engaging in active measures, spying, election meddling, and that sort of activity, but is outright backing in some ways terrorist attacks directly, not through not only by aligning with Islamist proxies or turning a blind eye to Chechens and groups of that nature, but um essentially sending its own people to engage in this sort of really, really violent activity that harkens back to not even the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union as well, but also to the to the pre-Soviet Tsarist era, where this sort of terrorism became an part of the internal political struggle in Russia and eventually made its way outwards. And not much has changed. It shows that the real powers are not really the political ideology or the official interest, but the security services and their willingness to do whatever it takes um, to retain power and to position themselves as entities in control and wreaking havoc of that sort has always been the favorite tactic. But I think first of all, this is not the only incident of such nature. There's been other arrests of Russians involved in planned terrorist attacks in the recent months, and all of these stories have been really, really underplayed in the media, not only in the French media, but also in the international media. Why? Because it's not convenient to think of Russians as terrorists. Russia made a big deal out of the ISIS-K attack on its own soil. Russia has tried to position itself as a counterterrorism partner for the West and for other international groups. It has officially banned the Muslim Brotherhood, despite, by the way, allowing Islamist groups to proliferate, but officially it's banned. So it has tried to portray itself as a victim of terrorism, but now we're seeing that they are actually Russian terrorists acting on the official state ideology and against Western interests. This sort of very radical positioning is a departure from a more controlled politics-oriented methods, and it creates in Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, not simply a sympathizer or a political enabler. And this is not something that I think Western security services are yet fully ready to admit. They're willing to understand, to accept Russian proxies like the Red Brigades in Germany, but they're not, who cooperate with Islamist jihadist groups. But I think they're really, admitting that there are terrorists who are acting on the behalf of Russia's interests active in Europe is a huge I think turning would be a huge turning point on policies, because at that point you can no longer pretend that you can just end things in Ukraine. This is no longer about Ukraine, and resolving things in Ukraine would not change what's happening elsewhere. That's, I think, is the biggest takeaway that nobody really wants to hear at this point in time, and will not until something terrible happens, or until sufficient number of such incidents pile up that there's no choice but to admit to it.
Right, right, Irina. So, talking of France, talking of Russia, let's also talk about Germany. Germany is out of Niger. So, there France is out, US is out, Russia is there, and now, again, now Germany is out. How do you see this panning out? Russian gaining strength, and and all other nations are coming out of Niger, and now there is this whole Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali. All these they have come up with military pact, with meetings and all that stuff, and now ISIS is moving into Uganda. How do you see this whole situation panning out? Is Russia again looking at that part of the world very, very strongly?
Well, Russia is gaining in the short term because their ultimate concern is gaining access to natural resources and basically, appearing politically influential. Look, we got the US and others kicked out and getting money for their own expenditures and so forth. But in the long term, I don't think Russia understands the level of threat that it's facing by remaining in countries that are about to overrun by separatists, by jihadist groups, and by all sorts of other security problems. And I don't think Russia is equipped to deal with it. I think they're limited to propping up these juntas against Western political efforts and African political efforts, but they're not equipped to handle the jihadist threats. And we've seen that time and again in Mozambique. Even in these three countries, um, Russia's alliance has not stopped terrorist groups and separatists from roaming over the country and taking over villages. So I don't think, and those countries are also beginning to see that Russia is not really the great boon that they had. Everyone was saying there was they came in at the height of this anti-French political populist wave, but their advantage is very limited to propping up the political elites. I don't think they are going to do much for the country, and not even in the security sector where they're promised. And I think they are about to themselves find challenged and humiliated by a group of jihadis, and I think it's going to make them look very, very weak, even more so than Ukraine, because Ukraine at least is a country with the military, it's receiving Western aid. You can make some excuses. In African countries where you have, you know, poorly trained jihadis running amok, that's not really an excuse. It just shows that Russia is just not what it used to be.
Right, right. And now let's talk. Let's go to our last topic of the day, talking about Iran. It's got a new president. supposedly a member of the reformist section, faction. What do we make out of that? What should again the world expect uh, out of Iran now? Much more moderate, much more strong. How should we know it now?
I don't think we should expect any radical changes. The system is not going to change. Iran's wars and terrorism are not going to change. Its nuclear ambitions are not going to change. In fact, none of its geopolitical strategy is going to change. The only thing that could change is the tone. The new president, as a candidate, promised to return to the table and GCPA negotiations. I think the idea is try to finagle some sanctions-related concessions in case Biden administration remains in power. If Trump um, joins, Trump has previously said that he wants a new deal that's better than Obama's. So even then, I think they will try to exploit negotiations and spend time. I think it's a time, face-saving device for Iran. In terms of Trump possibly appearing on the scene, I think they actually don't are not planning to do any of the things this new president is promising people. I think even internally, the economic changes, he has no power to actually do anything. So I think all of this is a lot of talk and a lot of manipulation by the regime, and we should not expect anything serious to take place.
Right, right. Lots of things are changing, and the world is also changing. Every 2 weeks, we come and get your expertise on understanding, analysis on all these topics. So, with it's a wrap on this very special edition of the world according to Irina Tsukerman, where we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks and get you back more analysis from Irina. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the world according to Irina Tsukerman.
Thank you so much.